do not think that a local jurisdiction, as much as it may want to, can get into the business of deciding what the power levels of a wireless transmitter can or should be.
Why is that? What's the law?
Well, it is because there is a long line of cases, although it is in the interference side of things, holding that they cannot do that. A local jurisdiction does frankly, I'm sorry, it's just a conflict preemption thing. They could not tell, say, Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T, you are limited in the amount of energy, your power levels. You can only do it down to this decibel level that is deemed worthy of voice-only service. I just don't think they have that power. I think they're conflicted.
Okay, so I understand you think they're conflicted. Let me tell you the logic that's behind it. And I'm not telling you that means it's supported by the case law. The logic is that we are all got a whole bunch of cities that are putting all kinds of policies in place in order to reduce their carbon footprint, in order to be a green city, in order to use energy efficiently. And we know for sure the most efficient way to move data is through fiber optic cable all the way to the site. And don't stop short and do it wireless. If you're trying to then send the data wirelessly, you're going to be expending a lot more energy to get the same thing done over the same distance. It doesn't make any sense for a city that wants to be green and efficient. Now, when you get down to can the local city do it or not, I think I just sit down and point to, well, what does the industry bring forward? They bring forward all kinds of propagation maps. Every single one has a green color on minus 85 dBm and above. It's kind of a lie in that map because nobody looks at what above is. But in Hank's case, it's minus 10 dBm or minus 5 dBm in his backyard. That's way over necessary. Think about the orders of magnitudes, right? That's 8 orders of magnitude. Let's do the zeros, right? So that's 10 million times too high for telecommunications service in his backyard. There's got to be some kind of control over what is a reasonable amount of power.
One, I completely agree that local jurisdictions should be trying to use every power that they have to encourage fiber to the premises, fiber to the home, as much as possible. And I would emphasize, as part of that, do undergrounding for both electric and telephone utility services,
Amen.
Wherever possible.
Amen.
And now, practical impact of that would be there's fewer poles out there for them to hang small cells on. They'd be relegated to, streetlights and other things. There's less structure for them to hang a small cell on. But that's not really the purpose here. The purpose here is to obtain efficiency, like you just said, and to reduce energy. You are absolutely correct that it costs much less to drive fiber to the home from an energy perspective than it does to have a wireless piece in it. Absolutely. Now, I will tell you that the FDA still has specific statutory jurisdiction over radiological devices, including cell phones and towers. And there's a petition before it right now asking them to assert that jurisdiction. There are other federal agencies that still have within their remit the authority to do some things. The EPA could, if it wanted, issue some regulations. If you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, we could, but we don't have a budget. We've been de-budgeted and have been since 1996. We were basically told to stay away from this as a political matter. Congress could tell the EPA to get active again, start protecting the environment. There are any number of ways to deal with this, and especially, for God's sake, please take this away from the FCC. Okay. And frankly, I'd just as soon it not be at the FDA either.
Right.
Put it somewhere else that's not so captured. Every agency is going to be captured, but those two in particular are very captured.
What did 19126 attempt to do? You see, it was a very interesting order because it came out in response to what was the NEPA case. And that was Kitawa et al. Versus the FCC. And they were told at that point in time to do environmental review on the whole program of putting out an additional 800,000 cell towers. And the FCC's kind of ignored it, and they went a different direction. And what they decided to do in 19-126 was their response to NEPA. It happened 3 or 4 months after the ruling, right? And they came out and ignored an open thing they had from 2012 and attempted in footnote 4 on page 3 to do some kind of de facto rulemaking in order to extend their SAR regulation. This is a really sneaky move that you caught, and you brought it up in your argument. And my question to you is, now that that order has been remanded, what has happened to that attempt? Isn't that no more?
Well, the court did not vacate.
They remanded, though.
Any aspect of the 2019 decision that we challenged in part at the DC Circuit. Remember, there were 4 parts to that order.
Right.
And we only challenged the notice of inquiry piece where the commission decided, no, we're not going to think about changing our emissions rules. We're not going to do that. They're just fine. They're ancient. They're old. They were written by the industry. They're thermal only, and we're going to ignore the biological effects. That's the part we challenged. We did not challenge 3 other parts of that same order. One was adoption of some new rules, and then another part was proposed new rules. What you're talking about is, I believe, the adoption of some rules, the part we did not challenge. Now, yes, we talked about it in oral argument, but we technically did not challenge it.
But let's just say what they tried to do, though. They said that, well, we have this thing called specific absorption rate, and here we are making a definitive move to say, well, it only goes up to 6,000 megahertz. So we're going to go ahead and extend it further. It's going to cover all the additional frequencies at the same time. And then we're going to allow ourselves to increase our peak to average ratio because, in these higher frequencies that are above 6,000 megahertz, we'll probably need more power in order to, make these things effective and work. All right. And I believe they attempted both of those things, as from my reading, in that order. Well, my question to you is, why would the FCC do that if they didn't need to do that?
Now you're talking largely about the notice of proposed rulemaking part of the 2019 order,
yes,
which, by the way, is still open. They haven't adopted those rules yet.
Mm-hmm.
They have not yet technically extended their existing rules above what would it? I'm drawing a blank on the number.
6,000 megahertz.
Yeah, they have not technically done it, although they do say in the order as a matter of just practice. We're doing it. But
excuse me, practice that's legal. It's just a matter of practice.
Somebody could challenge them. I don't know what the consequence of the challenge would be.
Oh, I think it's very simple. It is that SAR only exists up to 6,000 megahertz
As a formal thing, yes.
Right. So the point is, when you take a look at the original paper that came out in 1986, they did a very good job of laying out the case for specific absorption and specific absorption rate. 2 different ideas.
Yes.
Specific absorption is the total amount of energy you absorb. Specific absorption rate is the rate at which we're giving it to you. It was a trick to pick a specific absorption rate, just a trick. I went back to the FCC and federal OSHA in 2013 with a complaint against my school system. And I needed them to answer a very simple question. How much radiation would my daughter receive in a classroom with wireless access point in it in a 6-hour school day? Can you please answer that question? And then we have to understand whether we can rule on it based on that answer. And they just wanted to dismiss me. I said, I'm sorry, I'm intellectually honest here. I need an answer to that question. And they went through with me a full analysis of how to answer that question. And it's not surprising. You have to look at the total radiation over time, which means you have to look at a different unit. You cannot look at microwatts per square meter. You have to look at microwatts per seconds per square meter, which is similar to kilowatt hours. You buy kilowatt hours from your electric company. You don't buy the rate of electricity delivery. You buy the rate of electricity delivered times the time you use it. Well, the same thing has to work if you have to understand the total amount of radiation. So they wrote it all up. I got it in writing. I've had it since 2013. I share it with Deborah Davis. I share it with everybody I talk to, because to me, that is a fundamental admission right there. That specific absorption rate is non-substantive. There's nothing to it. It is only a trick.
It involves a lot of averaging, which
but even when you get down to the end of it, now you're still just looking at a rate. It's like saying to you, Scott, hey, how far did you drive yesterday? And what do you tell me? Oh, I drove 30 miles an hour. And I go, wait a minute. How far did you go? Oh, 30 miles an hour for a half an hour. So I drove 15 miles. All right. Now we have the answer. You see? Mm-hmm. And they're forcing everybody to, as a little trick, to talk about the rate of exposure, which is nonsense. You have to look at the total exposure over time. There's just no other way.
You do. And of course, the FCC rule only looks at during a test period of 30 minutes for the general population.
Yeah. Well, so I got the guy from FCC OET on the line. I said, now, look, come on. I read your rules and you want me to go out there and wave a meter around for 30 minutes in my classroom for my daughter. And what happens in the next 30 minutes? Right? Do we just pretend that the first 30 minutes never happened? Do we just zero it all out and do it again? And he says to me, Paul, we think this is the amount of radiation that your daughter can receive forever.
Well,
which is nonsense.
But they're not measuring that. And remember also,
they're not measuring what?
They're not measuring how much people get forever.
They're measuring the rate. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Whenever you're forced to talk about the rate of exposure, you will lose. That is why you need to start talking about the total amount of radiation.
From a biological perspective, that is certainly true.
Well, from a human life perspective, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. You also have to take a look at instantaneous response, not just average response over time.
Sure.
Hopefully, we will be able to get the FCC to reopen this proceeding that was remanded. They have done nothing since August. There's been a pending motion to reopen since late November. Environmental Health Trust filed that. It was, interesting motion. Had a whole bunch of new science in it that had happened since 2019. And, we're waiting to see what the commission is going to do. I don't see them very anxious to reopen that proceeding, so we're going to have to figure out something else to do.
Well, so meanwhile, we're sitting out here as a local city saying, do we have a federal guideline for SAR for anything above 6,000 megahertz? Is the answer no, correct? We don't.
The answer is no, but I don't know why the city would be concerned with it.
Because we're damaging and killing people in our own town?
Okay, so you're talking about applying this in the zoning perspective? Or
absolutely. Hi, what's the basis of my operational permit? Well, let's see. Do you have a federal guideline for anything above 6,000 megahertz? It looks like you don't. Why should I be giving you an operational permit? Tell you what, we're going to power you off until the FCC completes its environmental review as ordered by the court.
I don't think they can do that.
Why not?
I'm sorry. I think they'd be conflict preempted out.
In what way? I don't understand. There has to be a guideline, Scott, right? If there is no guideline, then why is there a basis for operating? And look, this affects a lot of people. Think about it. This affects all the satellites, affects the radar, all the stuff. If none of it has SAR, because it all comes from SAR, you realize it's a translation of SAR to get to microwatts per square meter. I read the paper. I know for sure it is. So the point is, the whole thing comes from one 1-hour experiment where they decided to irradiate monkeys and rats to the point where they could no longer seek their food. And when they could no longer do so, they were so brain damaged, then they took their temperature. That's where it comes from. That's the scam right there. That's directly from George Carlin.
Arbitrary multiple reduction, which...
Whatever.
It means nothing.
It all means nothing. Correct. And this is the way that you say to everybody, if you do not have a federal guideline, you have no basis to operate. Period. The end. Go get a federal guideline. The FCC fumbled it.
I grant all of your points from an abstract perspective. But when we're talking about in the zoning perspective, I do not think a local jurisdiction can do that.
Well, wait a minute. You have to have a federal guideline, right, in order to operate, right? You have to have a federal guideline for a license.
No, you have to have a federal license or permission to operate.
Correct.
That doesn't mean there has to be a guideline.
Let's talk about it. if I'm going to go ahead and do a license, there are conditions for my license. Number one, I got this right from the FCC. I've talked to them 4 times for 30 minutes each with an attorney on the line. All right. So they tell me that a condition of the license is to complete NEPA review. That's good. Got to do it. Number 2, they have to adhere to all FCC microwave radiation guidelines. Got it. Boom. Now, if you don't have a guideline, how are you adhering to it? I'm not saying regulating emissions. I'm saying regulating the operation. Either you let it operate or not. If you're not regulating the emissions, then you're saying you must have all your ducks in a row in order to go ahead and build this thing and operate it. Good. Are you adhering to all the federal guidelines you need to in order to operate this? Well, there is no guideline for something above 6,000 megahertz. When you get one, come on back.
I do not think that a local jurisdiction in the zoning context can say there is no guideline for this, therefore we're not going to allow you to do it.
Why not?
Because they have a license to operate.
But it's the point is the license is being threatened. So you can go after the wires company then to say that you are not adhering to a license because you're not adhering to a federal guideline because none exists.
It may well be there is no guideline. I am agreeing with you in principle. There is no guideline. Let's get back to that provision in the Communications Act that you mentioned, that they must operate at the minimum power required.
Yes.
You're correct. That applies to all radio stations.
Right.
That is a federal statute, and there are analogs in the FCC rules.
Mm-hmm.
Local jurisdictions in the zoning context do not have authority to enforce those rules. If somebody wants to enforce that statute and that rule, they need to go to the FCC or alternatively the court, a federal court.
Okay.
I think Scott agrees about the health risks. I think what the debate here is strategy and method for communities to seek.
Right. And I appreciate Scott's point of view here. We want to make sure that we understand exactly what we think we can do and not do.
Actually, so Scott,
here's what we can do.
If I may, Scott,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
If you are in a community such where there are people who are having health impacts, and they do want to pursue some of these regulations or controls, okay, and if they called you up, and again, your advice is worth an enormous amount of money per hour, we get it, but how would you suggest they get started? Maybe it's a different track than what Paul has been talking about. How do you get from A to B? A different
that
route?
might be tight.
Let's go to where the jurisdictions can act.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, notwithstanding all of the FCC regulations, a local jurisdiction can say, we don't want these things in a residential area.
Petaluma did that.
That's right. The only condition is if the wireless provider can show that it must put the facility at whatever location they've chosen in a residential area, they must put it there because that is the only way they can provide the service.
The telecommunication service.
The telecommunication service piece. You're right. Unless they can prove that it is an effective prohibition, then a city, and I'm talking site by site, a city can outlaw. So an ordinance that a city could pass is, we are saying nothing in residential areas. We are saying nothing within 1,500 feet of any residential areas. However, we will have a waiver process whereby if you really, really think, wireless company, that you must put something in this area that we've said you can't, then we will give you a waiver if you can prove that denial is an effective prohibition. And that's a hard test for the wireless company.
It is, because it has to be an effective prohibition of telecommunications service, which is the ability to make a wireless phone call outdoors. Talk about in-building coverage. Is there any in-building coverage in the law? You see, the problem is that a law is written and it doesn't anticipate everything. And that's what happens with case law, is things come before each circuit, and we have, I think, 11 versions of the TCA, right? Because all the case law is slightly different in each of the geographic circuits. So only when something is a disagreement between the circuits and it gets to the Supreme Court does it get unified. And so right now, in California, We don't have any case law that says in building coverage is necessary, required, or anything like that. It's not there. There's nothing about in building coverage at all in the Ninth Circuit.
There are some FCC rules on that, but it has to do with in the context of repeaters, Part 15 devices, clearly within their jurisdiction. They can enforce their building code, their fire code, and their electric code. I can tell you from personal experience, I looked at, I can't tell you how many of these applications these wireless providers give when they're looking for a permit. And their design documents are quite frankly hilarious. Okay. You cannot show, I've only seen one that really came close to passing muster. You cannot, an electrical engineer or structural engineer, for the most part, almost always, could not look at the design documents and say, these things are designed in a manner that minimizes risks to health and safety in terms of fire risk and other risks. They, stated another way, they can't prove they meet code. I've only seen one that actually was anything close to compliant. And I've talked to electrical engineers. Most of the ones I see, there's just nothing there. You can't see how well the thing is grounded. You can't see whether it's properly fused. You can't see from the designs what happens if lightning strikes. And these things are lightning attractors. If lightning strikes, you can't demonstrate based on the design documents that it's properly grounded and that the fuse will blow so that it does the electricity, the arc doesn't get into the stuff and set fire. Many of these cell tower fires that we've seen, they've been hung off on, anti-5G people. But what I really think is happening with at least many of them is there are electrical fires inside the tower. And when that happens, they're bad fires. And when that happens, especially in fire-prone areas, when that happens, it takes a while for the electric utility to get out there to turn off the power.
From faulty box designs or from a lightning attractor because perhaps they're not grounded in a way other devices would be.
They're not properly grounded. And there are many other aspects where when you look at the design documents, you cannot say, yep, that's safe. That's been designed properly. Yep, that's minimized all the risks. There's 5 risks generally that electrical engineers look at. The local jurisdictions are not looking at this. And so, if a local jurisdiction, especially one, say in California, where there's a big fire risk, if they wanted to be a bit more rigorous about it, they can make these guys prove that their design is adequate. And I can tell you, most of these designs are not adequate. And so they can start rejecting these applications on that basis. In order to get a proper design, because these guys use cookie cutters, right? All their designs are cookie cutter designs.
Right.
And then they do minor modifications based on the conditions on the ground. If it's a salty environment, say near the ocean, they may put in more protection against rust and corrosion. If it's a windy environment, they'll do more structural work. If more local jurisdictions were to force them to do an adequate design, ultimately, they would have to change their cookie cutter to be better designed. That would have the beneficial effect of improving safety throughout the country, but it would also, by the way, significantly increase the capital costs of putting out these towers, which, since they all operate on a budget, they all have capital budget, means fewer towers.
So what you're really saying is that by the local jurisdiction digging in and looking more carefully at how these are designed or not well designed, they can essentially, through local laws, force them to put seatbelts, airbags, and speed limits on these cell tower installations in order to make sure that they are constructed in a safer manner. Well, that's the bottom line, is that we have to somehow get regulation over something which is just the wild, wild west, right? They're just coming in to stick things in the cheapest way possible, and not enough people are paying attention to the standards that matter. Now, here in California, we have a rule, a Cal OSHA, which goes further than federal OSHA, and they are allowed to do that. And they say no machinery can be operated above high voltage lines. Yet, There are many of these small cells where they stick a canister antenna, 4-foot tall antenna, right on top above high voltage lines.
That may be a violation. Now, that's an OSHA violation, and so it involves the work involved in placing it up there. I don't know what the consequence is for those that have already been placed.
Right. But I mean, if the principle is that we shall not operate machinery above a high voltage line, after they've done the work, what have they left behind? A machine doing work above high voltage lines. A cell tower is a machine that is transforming electromagnetic power coming through a radio. And but the point is that even in the FCC 18-133 case, the guy came up to talk for the utilities. And he says, look, the minute you cross over that area, you're in a whole new world. It's like crossing over into Mars. There are things up there that have to have special coatings. There are things up there to prevent arc flashes from happening. And none of this equipment has that. And
I agree with all that.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be up there, if you want to know the truth. They should not be up there.
So can't a city say, for citing public safety, take them down?
I think a city could say, if for nothing else, for aesthetics purposes, that they don't want these canisters on the top of the poles. It needs to be lower.
All right. Let me ask you about aesthetics for a second. Everybody says, oh, yes, you can use your aesthetics locally. Okay. Well, aesthetics, beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And so therefore, there's no objective measure for aesthetics. So if I'm a local city and I decided that it's aesthetically pleasing for me to require every wires telecommunication facility in my town to be 200 feet tall, because doing so will force it to be entered into the FCC database. And we want FCC oversight on these very dangerous things. If we're forced to have one, we're going to put it nice and tall so it can serve the entire town, so we don't need as many of them. And that is aesthetically pleasing to us. That's legal, is it not?
I don't know. There's some of the small cell rules may prohibit that. I'd have to take a look at that. I do kind of like the idea, though, of making these things bigger and uglier so that people will actually begin to realize they're out there and look at them.
What are
for aesthetics purposes, we could require that there be a big clown nose on there or something, make it really, really ugly so that everybody would have to look at it, therefore not want it there.
The upshot of the ruling that you got in August of 2013 is we're waiting for the FCC to do their work. They're dragging their feet not to do it. Environmental Health Trust is trying to force them to do it. But is that all we can do? Is have that thing, or can we do anything else?
Well, I think that people should be writing to their senators and Congress critters and saying, please tell the FCC to reopen the proceeding, get to work, and do biologically based rules. That'd be a good thing. They could write to the FCC and say the same thing. Although I'll tell you, as a practical matter, the FCC doesn't read your letters.
Right.
Okay? They just don't.
Right.
They don't. They don't pay any attention to something that doesn't come in from some law firm or some really large organization. They just don't. Go straight in the file can. And the commission has got a problem. Look, in their hearts, they know there is a biological response.
Right.
When you are exposed, they know. Okay. They pretend it's only thermal, but they know. The evidence is just so clear these days. Now, the real issue is it harmful? And if so, to whom? And at what level? And what over time? What happens when you begin to look at cumulative exposure, simultaneous exposure? And these are all really hard questions. And if they make the admission that there's a biological response and the commission looks at the rest of its rules and it goes, oh my God, I got to rewrite everything. They don't know what to do, so they're going to do nothing until they are forced to. So we need to force them to reopen that proceeding and face these hard questions.
If I could ask to expand upon something about the biological response and how, when you first started looking at these cases several years ago, perhaps you were a little bit skeptical about what the impact was. Which is,
I ran with engineers all my life. I was buying into the thermal thing. Okay, I just did.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw the evidence.
Well, that's impressive, because sometimes it can be difficult to see the evidence, even though the evidence is right in front of someone. we
And
have
sometimes you're paid to not see the evidence.
we
right?
have chemical sensitivities in our family, for example, and so there's certain regulations or limitations on what we can have in our house and products we can use. And it wasn't until we personally had to experience some of it that we realized that these sensitivities are real. And it might have seemed it was difficult to believe that some people might have not wanted to go out to dinner with someone that had just used fabric softener on their pants. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on your own, that moment that you were able to open up, or perhaps it was quite easier for you because you were with engineers, so you were always perhaps more open-minded.
Well, I always, whenever I get a case, I try to look at it from all sides. Having some trial experience, doing cases at the trial type level, whether it's in an agency or in a court, one of the first things you need to do is prepare so that, quite frankly, you could try either side of the case. And so, even though I came in with this set of preconceptions, I was forced to read the evidence. I mean, after all, I'd been hired to advance case. But the more you look at the evidence and the more you look at it objectively, it is just so clear. It is just so clear that there is a biological response. I mean, just think of it. When you go and get an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, okay, what is that designed about? The whole purpose of how an MRI works is to evoke a biological response. And how do they do that? By manipulating magnetic and radio frequencies. And they observe how the body responds to the varying frequencies. When the body inside this tube is exposed to the magnetic waves with the RF waves, all within thermal limits, by the way, okay, the body responds. It sends out tiny little microwave signals. And that is what they are reading when they take an MRI. The whole purpose of it is entirely based on the fact that there is a biological response to magnetic and radio frequency emissions. So how can there not be? But nonetheless, the question in my mind, and I think the FCC in its heart of hearts, if they have one, knows this. So, the question then becomes, okay, well, there's a response. Can it be negative? And so you look at the evidence and you start finding all of these people who, for whatever reason, are indeed exhibiting symptoms after exposure. And you can show in any number of ways that that's got to be. I mean, they go somewhere where there's RF and they experience symptoms. They get away from it in a relatively RF-free zone and they feel great. Then they come back in and they start getting sick again. Now, I know that that's not direct evidence, but it's a pretty good indication of cause.
And there's many.
So it is.
Yeah.
And then you begin to understand how that happens. And you can easily imagine that there are many other negative effects, especially over the long term, that could flow from this. DNA damage, sperm damage, and ultimately cancer. Just looking at it from a medical and even a regulatory perspective, it is clear there are risks here.
And the doctor's notes matter because that's substantial written evidence, isn't it? The diagnosis
it is. And you can look at it from a general population perspective. You can look at it from certain cohorts within the population. You can get all the way down to the individual level. And it is so clear now that there are specific, discrete individuals who are already exhibiting symptoms, some of them quite devastating, to the point that they are driven out of their own home when a cell site gets put right in their front yard.
Right.
You can begin to imagine the long-term effects on everyone. It's pretty clear that everyone who is exposed, they're responding in some way. We need to start getting, and I try as much as I can to minimize the amount that they are exposed. I mean, why not? Let's emphasize doing Ethernet in your home. Don't have a Wi-Fi repeater. Get this stuff out of where you sleep. Limit the amount of time that your kids can have on these devices. We need to, as a society, recognize the risk and begin to educate everyone of if we can't get rid of it completely, we've got to minimize it as much as possible. Let's get fiber to the home. Let's reduce wireless only to when mobility is required. Do we really, really need all of these little Internet of things that everybody hates, but the industry thinks is going to give them their next $1 trillion? I mean, quite frankly, I don't need to be able to remotely talk to my refrigerator to find out whether I've got 5 eggs or 3 eggs. I don't need that.
I'm with you. I don't need that either. Well, you know what this is really ends up being? And, the problem is that when you try to establish the health effects, it's just so emotionally charged that nobody wants to go there. But if you take some steps back, and I'd say this to local cities, you go to nuisance laws, and there are a lot of nuisance laws that can help you, particularly in California. We have a California Supreme Court ruling in 2019
on the public right away.
Right.
Yeah.
And they say travel is not the sole use of public roads. Other uses may be incommoded beyond the obstruction of travel. They list them. Generate noise. What is pulsation and modulation? It's noise. Cause negative health consequences or create safety concerns. All these impacts could disturb public road use or disturb its quiet enjoyment. And isn't that exactly what a small cell does? It ruins the quiet enjoyment of our streets and our homes.
It does. Now, I like that decision because it says California basically, you at least in your organic state law can go as far as federal law will allow you.
Correct.
And so your job is to just take it to the limit where federal law allows you.
Exactly.
Edge. Go to the edge. I don't ever want to advocate that somebody go over the edge.
Right.
But there is an edge, and we could go there, and it would be a materialist system.
All right. So substantial written evidence that proves there's no significant gap in telecommunications service. Isn't making a phone call sufficient? Why is that not sufficient evidence?
I could talk for days about what's left of the significant gap test. Let me just say that even under the FCC's lenient test, they would still have a hard time showing an effective prohibition. Getting back to what I said before, if there was a zoning regulation that says not in residential, they would still have a hard time, even under the FCC's much lower test than significant gap.
Finish up on whatever you actually put out yesterday. You were so kind to send it to me. I read it. It's excellent. Why don't you tell me what you filed yesterday?
There's this other set of rules that the FCC put out, has to do with basically radio antennas that are not used for mobile service, internet access, things like that. The FCC had this rule called the over-the-air receiving device rule. It started out limited to things like satellite dishes and other small receiving dishes. A lot of the local jurisdictions had basically tried to ban satellite dishes. And Congress and the FCC said, no, we kind of think we want that. So we're going to preempt the city's ability to ban by ordinance these little satellite dishes. Once the FCC got its rules in place, a little after 1996, it promptly began to expand the scope of this over-the-air receiving devices rule. Now it doesn't have anything to do with receiving devices anymore. It covers any antenna that is used to receive or transmit communications so long as they are not personal wireless service. In other words, not cell phone service. But until recently, this OTARD rule, as bad as it was limited in scope in that somebody with an over-the-air receiving device system, could use it to support wireless service, say through a router, only for people on that premises. Last year, the FCC decided, well, we're going to expand this rule so that now not only can you use this OTARD facility for serving your own premises and maybe your neighbor, we're going to let these wireless ISPs come in and serve not just this premise, but also whoever else they can reach with whatever kind of antenna is still small enough to fit the size limitations, 3 meters. Any antenna that is less than 3 meters in diameter can now be placed on a tower on private property and used to serve a wide area, provide basic internet access service. And we're talking about basically now, at this point, because of the technology, we're now talking about a base station, the equivalent of a cell phone base station, going in on private property without any local permitting. They expressly preempted the whole permitting regime for these OTARD systems. Even worse, if I happen to live in a community where there's a restrictive covenant that says no commercial activities within our community, everything's residential only, or you can only have a satellite dish, but you can't have a tower taller than 12 feet, and you could only use it for your own personal purposes. That's all preempted. Last year, the FCC decided that restrictive covenants of this nature was going to preempt them too. And so people who purposely went to an area where they had these restrictive covenants in an effort to avoid RF, and got these restrictive covenants, paid for these restrictive covenants, had them recorded in their deeds, and with all the other ones, they can't enforce it now. So they think they're living in a safe community, and their next door neighbor can now put up basically a base station right on the property line without notice, without their permission, and begin poisoning them. They won't know about it until they either see it or it starts making them sick. So we thought, this is pretty bad. This is pretty bad. It's a sneaky way to get all around all these local regulations that pertain to personal wireless service. There's no aesthetics regulation. There's hardly any safety regulation. It's just Wild West. So we took it to the DC circuit and we tried to challenge it.
Now, we as the Children's Health Defense was the plaintiff,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and some individual plaintiffs.
Got it.
And, we thought we had a pretty good case. We thought we had a chance, but sadly the court ruled against us. It said that the commission, we had not preserved the issue of the commission's authority to do it under what's known as Section 303 of the Act, which is their basic authorization. We had contended that 303 didn't allow them to do this. They said that the commission did not have to take health effects into consideration during that. That should have been raised in the 2019 decision, which had already been remanded. We had raised some Americans with Disabilities Fair Housing Act claims, saying that the commission was apparently preempting the ADA and the FHA. And the court said, thankfully, in a footnote, oh, come on, a commission rule can't overrule a statute. Yesterday, we filed a panel rehearing request. We're asking them to take a look at the record again, because actually we did preserve the 303 question. It's right there.
Can I interject and just please read for everybody the one paragraph that you gave me yesterday? It's on near the end, and it's appropriately labeled conclusion and prayer. The commission is not just skating on thin ice. The order's skate blades have no solid support in Section 303, yet the amendment affects a hockey-style blind stick swinging sucker punch on the petitioners and all those similarly situated. The FCC is knowingly, callously, and purposefully putting petitioners' lives at risk, driving them from their homes, and forcing them once again search, probably in vain, for a new place of refuge from involuntary toxin-induced suffering they've made every effort to avoid. The court must blow its whistle, signal the penalty, and end this administrative tyranny. Thank you for that. Now, it's true that we have to skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck has been. But Mr. McCollough, you have quite a way with the words, and I appreciate the effort here.
That was beautiful.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm just a word merchant. These rehearings they're hard to get. This is, I think we're right. I think we were right the first time. We'll see if we can convince the court to maybe take a look at it, but we had to take a try. This rule, even more so than all this stuff with wireless, small cells outside people. This really does present a very significant threat because it's entirely unregulated. I mean, we can't even talk about how to make these things purdy. I don't think they're purdy. I don't think they're ever purdy, but we can't even talk about that. We can't have residential setbacks. We can't do any of these things. The OTARD rule is an abomination. And, hopefully the court will listen. We need to keep getting more and more people active. We need to begin to assert our rights everywhere we can, including under the ADA, the FHA, and the Rehabilitation Act. We need to fight from the ground up, and we need to fight from the top down. And hopefully by the time we reach the middle, we'll be in a better place.
Well, the good news is you're an ex-Marine and you know how to fight. We appreciate you fighting for us. So I love the words that get the fighting done. But I do want to point out to everybody that this final rule is not very well written, and it is for services that are not classified as telecommunication services, and it cannot include commingled services. And that's the way the rule is written. And commingled is this really weird concept, right? Commingled is you put two things together and you can't separate them out again. That's what commingling is. So what they're trying to say somehow is that, well, we're telling you it has to be a non-telecommunication service. It can only
has to be
information service.
Entirely an information service. There can
okay,
be no
but I'm going to describe for you what really happens. I'm in an area kind of like yours. I don't have good internet access through the towers, let's say. But I'm served by a cable provider. So the cable provider gets me my coaxial cable to my house, and I go ahead and choose to run a wireless router in order to make a Wi-Fi call, because my phone has that capability. I can connect by Wi-Fi, make a call on the network. It goes through to my mother out back in Connecticut, and we have a conversation. I have just experienced a commingled service.
What the commission means by this part of the OTARD rule is you can't be using this to provide cell phone service.
But I just did.
Well, no, you didn't.
I didn't. I just made a call.
No, you used a voice client that employs session initiation protocol, probably by a provider who has no association with the guy that's giving you the physical layer service.
Excuse me, no, Verizon gives me this option on my phone. On my Verizon phone that I purchased from Verizon and I pay every month for allows me to make a Wi-Fi call. That's part of my service with Verizon, who is a provider of telecommunication service. So of course it's Verizon. So I just had commingled service, have I not?
There is a question whether voice over IP itself is a telecommunications service. There's a petition right now at the FCC to classify it as such. For right now, presently, the FCC informally treats it as an information service.
But what we do want to make sure everybody gets is that there's an onion involved here. Okay, Scott's at the center of the onion. Okay, he understands the communication protocols. He understands exactly what the case law is. He understands exactly how one thing connects to the other and how difficult it will be to establish certain arguments based on previous case law and how it's been interpreted already. This is all real. This is important stuff. And only people who Scott, who have this kind of experience can actually forge and make these kinds of arguments. Now, we don't have the benefit of his training out here doing his best work we can. Hey, we might be just as smart as Scott, but we don't do the kind of work that Scott does. Okay. So we don't have the benefit of the deep knowledge. Many things that I come up with are logical. Now, I'm just telling you they're logical. It's based on a plain reading of what I can read, but I don't have the benefit of reading all of that case law. So I really do appreciate when Scott points out there are certain things that have to be considered, and you can't necessarily get from point A to point B if you're doing it. Now, I'm in the middle of the onion, right? I'm trying to take stuff from people like Scott and Trevor Marshall and other people that really, really get it. And then we got to communicate it to the outside population in general. And so they can actually make progress. Now, I believe Scott just gave you the reasons why it would be difficult to make this argument in court. However, it is not difficult to make this argument to your neighbors. And this is my consideration for everyone, is you just sit down and say, this is a very poorly written rule, and there's all kinds of holes in this, and it's going to hinge on whatever somebody interprets commingled to be. But at the end of the day, you put that antenna in your house, you're going to ruin the quiet enjoyment of my home. And I'm going to take that very seriously. I'm going to suggest you don't take this discounted service and you just keep the antenna off your home and just stick with your cable service, because it could be the most expensive decision you ever made. Now, I don't have to go through the full legal analysis to try to communicate to my neighbors not to do this. It's a bad idea to do this, but I am going to point out to them that this is a very poorly written rule, and then let them make a decision.
Well,
Right?
you could also suggest to them that if they put that tower up, they better very seriously review their insurance coverage.
Exactly. So the point is, I'm letting them all know that I will be enforcing the quiet enjoyment of my home right around this neighborhood, because I'm very serious about it. So just put that in your thinking cap as you make your decisions going forward. So I think we do have to inform our neighbors that this is, what's coming, and you don't have to go along with it. And we suggest you don't go along with it.
Ask as soon as you hear of it, just ask them nice. Please don't do that. Okay. You're going to make me sick. Please don't make me sick, because you wouldn't like me when I'm sick.
Yes. Well, what I find is that you need both carrot and stick in order to get something done.
Well, let's give
Scott
a minute between him and this generous allotment of time and your next commitment. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for your service so much, and thank you for what you're doing with all of the work you're doing for this community. I appreciate it.
It's a joy. Good talking with y'all.
Yeah, and I want to say that you're a scholar, you're a gentleman, you're a hero to all of us who are electromagnetically sensitive. We appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you, Scott.